in case somebody does ask, what would you like me to tell them? I'm thinking, end a career. He glared at me and then he said, well, Colonel, you tell them, I'm quoting, that we are preventing the North Vietnamese from interfering in the democratic process in South Vietnam. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I can't say that. Well, why not, Colonel? Well, sir, if that's why we're there, I don't want to be the one that spreads the word. And he sent me down the next morning to talk to his chief security advisor in the basement of the White House. So finally he said, what do you think we ought to do? And I said, for God's sakes, sir, mine the harbors, because everything they used came in by ship bottom. Gas, missiles, ammunition, everything, food. His response, when I said mine the harbors, was, we can't do that. That's an act of war.
The F-101 story is a tale of changing requirements and challenging missions associated with the historic Cold War. Before the last Canadian Voodoo was retired in 1987, the F-101 series flew reconnaissance, bomber escort, nuclear alert, and nuclear interceptor missions. However, we'll focus for the moment on an incident that marks the beginning of the Voodoo story, and it's a little-known event during the Korean War called Black Tuesday. On the morning of October 23, 1951, 9 B-29 Superfortress bombers took off to attack the North Korean Namsi airfield. Soviet piloted MiG-15s rose up in defense of their territory and intercepted the B-29s, with 6 of the 9 bombers shot down in the subsequent engagement. Events like this throughout the Korean War, in addition to experience hard-won from World War II, clearly painted the picture for the U.S. Air Force generals. Unescorted bombers were sitting ducks for enemy aircraft. There was one way to counter this problem. And it was, of course, if the Americans brought their own aircraft. There is just one minor problem. No fighter existed with the fuel range to fly alongside U.S. bomber groups, a problem that had affected the earlier 8th Bomber Wing during the Nazi campaign of World War II. Many experiments and prototypes were tested, but all fell short in one form or another, simply because of the physical reality that if you bring enough fuel to flight a mission alongside the bombers, the subsequent aircraft will be too large to actually maneuver as a fighter. Subsequently, if you make a small airplane that can maneuver, it will likely not possess the necessary fuel to escort the bombers. After long research into various solutions, such as the abortive parasite fighter concept that led to the hilariously configured and rather ugly F-85 Goblin, the U.S. Air Force got back to the practical realities of the matter and issued a requirement for a long-range jet-powered bomber intercept. McDonnell's response to that requirement took flight as the XP-88. After a review of the proposals from other preeminent fighter constructors of the time, such as Lockheed and North American Aviation, the U.S. Air Force chose the XF-88 as the winner of the long-range fighter contract. The detonation of the first Soviet atomic bomb prompted immediate reprioritization of the U.S. Air Force budget. With the nuclear arms race now fully in swing, the U.S. Air Force diverted every spare penny it had to constructing B-36 nuclear bombers in a frantic rush to outpace the Soviets. In this process, the XF-88 program's budget was cut to a lovely total of $0 for the next fiscal year. As you might imagine, that can impede the progress on the development program. However, General Curtis LeMay, in his wisdom, resumed the long-range fighter program after the terrible events of Black Tuesday, and with the advent of the B-47 and the then new B-52 Stratofortress, it was clear that those bombers, once the Soviets built jet interceptors, would also need a defensive fighter of their own. McDonnell built the first F-101A in September 1954, with the aircraft first flying from Edwards Air Force Base. The F-101A would go on to fulfill a grim but necessary mission. Among its other capabilities, in the event of World War III against the Soviet Union, F-101s from Europe would fly into Soviet airspace at low level, carrying one singular nuclear weapon on the centerline station. The powerful fighter would fly fast and low in a time and age when navigation was very primitive and GPS was not even on the radar of the DARPA people thinking up the next generation of technology. So pilots flying with pen, paper, and wits would fly fast and low to climb up and loft their bombs in what was called a loft toss maneuver. This was a grim but necessary job that many pilots of the time flew in preparation for World War III, and it was a mission that even Colonel Robin Knowles himself was not a fan of. Well, of course, the Soviet Union was not asleep at the wheel and were developing many capable combat fighters, such as the MiG-17 and the MiG-21. These aircraft all featured an interesting and similar flaw. The MiG-17 was not capable of safe supersonic flight, although if the pilot didn't care about their health, they could nurse the thing into a high-speed supersonic dive before probably ejecting in a very unsafe posture because the MiG-17's design was simply not built for those speeds. And of course, the MiG-21 was built in many ways to address the shortcomings of the earlier MiG-17 and MiG-19. However, the MiG-21 also had a flaw. While it was capable of intercepting B-52s and could achieve Mach 2 at higher altitude, at lower level, the MiG-21 of the time, which was the F-13 model, could not go faster than approximately Mach 0.8 below 10,000 feet. And this was because of the aerodynamic forces on the aircraft. This was a flaw that was discovered by the U.S. during the Have Donut testing protocols. A story for a different day. So below 10,000 feet, the F-101A was the fastest thing moving, and even was faster in some respects than the vaunted F-104 starfighter. So at that low altitude, an F-101A was basically uninterceptable by the Soviet block fighters of the time. That would only end once the advent of the much later MiG-23. That would mark the beginning of the end of low-altitude penetration being a safe haven for attacking fighters in the event of World War III. But that would be, of course, substantially later in the future. Long before the Soviet flogger would ever take to the skies, the F-101A essentially enjoyed a precipitous and unmatched high-speed advantage below 10,000 feet. With nothing in the Soviet bloc capable of intercepting it, a Voodoo would have been a very dangerous opponent going up against the Warsaw Pact. Part of the maneuver involved a climb, which would have been a relatively perilous maneuver in the F-101 owing to its T-tail design. While the design was chosen at the time because in the 1950s, metallurgy simply did not allow a horizontal stabilizer that could be in the engine efflux, which is of course very hot coming from the back of the tailpipe. So the T-tail had to be built to keep those parts away from the hot jet exhaust. Incidentally, this is one of the reasons why in the later F4, the horizontal stabilizers are angled the way they are. The other reason the F4 that would replace the Voodoo has those angled stabilizers is due to the F-101's flaws. The Voodoo had a characteristic where if the airplane was pulled into too tight of a turn or too tight of a climb, the F-101 would spin out of control after doing a little imitation of what would later be called the Pugachev Cobra. So that situation was called a pitch-up, and generally, if you entered it below 10,000 feet, it was an unrecoverable flight condition. Quite a few F-101s would be lost to this issue, and while a control system was later installed that would keep the pilot out of trouble most of the time, it was still an issue that had to be looked out for, even with the later enhancements in the F-101C. The F-101 would continue in the nuclear strike and air defense roles until the 1960s, when the McDonnell Douglas F-4C Phantom II would supersede the design. But before the F-101 story would end, it's worth sharing an interesting story on the aircraft. At the time, Colonel Robin Knowles, around about the early 1960s, was on the list to be promoted to general. And to hear it from his own words, he was in a position where Well, as a matter of fact, why am I even telling you the story? I'll let the man tell it to you himself.
War was just heating up over there in Southeast Asia. I missed Korea. I was damn well not going to miss this one.
Earl's only option was to find a way to get himself off the promotion list. To that end, he staged an impromptu, low-altitude aerobatic demonstration just outside of London. Sure enough, Earl's commander called him in.
He pulled out a piece of paper, waved it in my face, said, "You can't see this, but that says you'll never be promoted." I think now we're getting somewhere. Then he waxed really furious and eloquent, and finally shook his finger at me in an utter rage. And he said, "And you are the kind of Air Force officer that ought to be in Southeast Asia." And I jumped up and saluted him, said, "Thank you very much, sir," and walked out of the room. And he was still shouting at me.
So those of you who have subscribed to my channel will remember in my review of the Reconnaissance 2-seat F-101G that I didn't view it likely that HobbyMaster would ever make a single-seat Voodoo, just because this is a relatively niche airplane, and, well, you just make more money building Jolly Roger F-14s and, F-35s. So where would be the financial incentive for HobbyMaster to do a dedicated single-seat Voodoo? Well, I'm glad to say that I was very wrong about that, because here it is, right? The single-seat Voodoo, and it is a marvel. So first off, we'll start with the pros on it. The finish is really nice. The photos and even my video really don't capture the depth of the paint finish. It's really well done, very even. There's no blotches or spots that are more or less shiny or inconsistent. The finish is very well done, and I think it's fairly close to what can be replicated versus the lacquered bare metal of the original F-101A and F-101Cs of the time. We should also note carefully that the paint finish of the Voodoos did change over time. Originally they were bare metal, but then corrosion issues were encountered, which prompted the U.S. Air Force to change the finish to a lacquer bare metal, and then right before the F-101C's retirement, they even had a few painted in like air defense gray in some parts. So it really depends on the time period when you look at these. But for when this represents, which is when the wings at Bentwaters were commanded by Colonel Robin Olds, this is, of course, the color of the Voodoo that he would have flown when he flew his illegal demonstration team. I think it's very accurate and captures the design really well. The small details like the names on the front, the small labels, as well as the stars and the colors of all three of the squadrons and the groups under the wing. The way Air Force ranks work, you have the wing, and underneath the wing you have the groups, and in the groups you have the squadrons. So the three colors represent the three operational groups of the Bentwaters wing at the time. So being the commander's airplane, he has colors of all three groups on the aircraft, and the aircraft of each individual group and squadron will, of course, just have that single tail color. So this tradition, by the way, is continued today in some parts of the Air National Guard as well as the active duty Air Force units. So the canopy is really well done. It's not built into the airplane where it tips up and tips down. You have to change it, but I think the separate pieces help with the accuracy. You also don't have to worry about fussy internal parts and potentially breaking it if you open it just a little too aggressively. And you do get period correct and really good accessories. The detail on the nuclear weapon store is really well done, and the fuel tanks, well, actually we'll get to some of that in the cons, but the fuel tank shape is actually really well done. That is a good place to pivot to talking about some of the drawbacks, because while the shape of the tanks looks good, the location of them is too far back on the airframe. They should actually be mounted a little bit forward. If you want to correct this, you can do it by just clipping the front parts of the brackets that it uses to kind of snap into the model. That'll allow you, with some blue tack on the back, to put it in at the proper position and keep it as far forward on the fuselage as it should be for accuracy's sake. But all things considered, if you just attach them as is, the result is not that far off that it's a major accuracy hit, but it is something to note. Also, the F-101s also did quite a bit of conventional bomb practice, and it would have been nice to see like an SUU-22A kind of bomb dispenser on the center line, also to complement the nuclear weapons store. The F-101s also did some conventional strike, which was something that the U.S. Air Force didn't really promote, but Colonel Old still felt that those skills were useful and needed, even while most of his peers were busy prattling on about how conventional warfare was not going to ever happen again. Those of you who've read his memoirs know where that chapter comes from. And the one of the gun muzzles on the F-101, I think on the lower left side, is replaced with a TACAN antenna on the F-101Cs. This is to help with navigation, especially important at a time and place long before GPS. And there is no the accurate airplane, I believe, didn't even have a fitting under there. It was just the 3 guns, and then that fitting was deleted to accommodate the TACAN antenna and the associated avionics at the time. So that was a small miss, but it is something to point out if you're somebody who's looking at the most precise model you can get. But all things considered, is it a worthwhile addition to your collection? Absolutely. It's beautiful. It's big. It's an old school airplane that doesn't get a lot of press play, overshadowed a bit by its successor, which is the F-4C Phantom II, and then the later variants thereof, the C and the D and the E. So I think it's worth adding, and of course the history behind the aircraft itself, Robin Olds, as well as its participation in an illegal and well-flown air show in Royal Air Force Bentwaters is something really special, because that's of course how Robin Olds got himself in a position to go to Southeast Asia. And to me, the airplane model not only represents the history of the aircraft and Colonel Old and his legacy as a general when he retired, but also the importance of managers versus leaders. And this is a unprecedented time right now of turnover and change in the DoD in early 2025. And right now the military is grappling with the problem, probably more acutely now than ever, of managers versus leaders. After decades of political presidents and very political generals and political secretaries of defense, we've now come to a place where the military leadership has become a very box check culture. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing the consequences of it in reduced readiness, accidents, and we're seeing it with just tales of airplanes crashing and pilots only getting 8 hours in the previous month, ejection seats not working because the maintainers don't have the parts to fix it when they're supposed to be fixed, and just stuff like this. And it's leading to a situation where we're seeing what happens when the military is run by managers instead of leaders like General Olds. And we need to bear that lesson, not even just in the military context, although it's definitely necessary there, but also in just day-to-day life, because people will sacrifice for leaders, but they're only clocking in and clocking out for managers. And right now we've got an excess of managers in the military and excessive managers in the civilian secretariat, and probably we don't have very many leaders in the civilian world either. So keeping this airplane model in your collection, maybe it represents that for you. For me, having this aircraft in my collection along with the F-4C that Robin Olds flew during Operation Bolo and his time later in Southeast Asia, that represents a time and place and a way of thinking that I think to some extent we need to go back to if we're going to be a country that has reason to stand proudly. There's a difference between cheering on a mantra and having nothing backing it up, and there's a difference between being great and not having to cheer because your accomplishments stand on their own. That's the nation we need to be again someday, and looking at this model in my collection gives me hope that someday we'll get back to that place. Thanks for watching, everyone.